Hi, good morning. My name is Dante, and this is our spiritual activism panel. Today is Saturday, October 28th, 2023, and I'm going to open us up this morning with a prayer, and it is in both English and Spanish. And after that, I will finish my brief introduction and hand it over to the other individuals in this group to introduce themselves, and then we're going to dive into our questions that we brought to the panel today to discuss amongst ourselves. So starting off with the English prayer. Dear ancestors, guides, loved ones, we ask for your help in this meeting. We ask for your strength, we ask for your clarity, we ask for your guidance. And I would like to offer up a prayer that has come from my heart for our space today, but also for the time that we are in humanity. Forgive us, Goddess, for the faults of yesterday, for the faults of tomorrow, and for the faults we cannot comprehend. Forgive us for our anger, forgive the pain. Send us healing, send us clarity, so that we heal, so that we can stop, so that we may mend, and so that we can be in love again. Y en español, perdónanos, Diosa, por las faltas de ayer, por las faltas de mañana, y por las faltas que no podemos comprender. Perdona nuestras iras, perdona el dolor. Envíanos corazón, envíanos claridad, para que sanamos, para que paramos, para que no arreglemos, para que podamos volver a amar. Thank you, ancestors. Thank you, guides. I would like to introduce myself. As I said earlier, my name is Dante, and I am a PhD student at the California Institute of Integral Studies in the Women's Spirituality program, which focuses on the decolonialization of spirituality, indigenous spirituality, and envisioning a future where we can experience spirituality from a non-patriarchal, non-colonized space, and giving us the tools to do that. I run an online community called ARCADIA. I'm a professional psychic medium, multi-generational healer, and I am a student of indigenous shamanism. I am on unceded territory of the Chichimex in the city of San Miguel de Allende. And I would like to now hand over the introductions to those who are also on the panel here this morning, who has graciously volunteered their time to be here this morning. Thank you.
My name is Mackie. I am on the native unceded land of the Quapaw, Caddo, and Osage tribes. I am an educator, an artist, and the co-founder of a wellness and education organization called Body of Work Holistic, where we focus on blending holistic healing practices and education, art, nature from a decolonized lens. And thank you for inviting me here today.
I'm happy to pick up next. My name is Logan. I am also a student at the California Institute of Integral Studies. I am a student, so I am always curious. I am a dreamer and I am a lover. My pronouns are they, them, theirs, and I am on the unceded territory of the Tovangar, which is Tongva for the world.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nero. I'm currently in the unceded territory of the Quapaw, the Caddo, and the Osage tribes as well. I'm also a co-founder of Body of Work Holistic, and I'm honored to be here.
Thank you all so much. What beautiful introductions and beautiful faces and beautiful souls that are here today. We've all been invited to bring to the panel this morning our own questions that are on our hearts around spiritual activism. And so I'm going to offer up one of my questions to get the meeting started, and then we will take turns as it naturally flows to whatever other questions we may like to go ahead and ask from our own list. So this question, I noticed considerable overlap with some of the other questions submitted. And so I'm going to start us off with this question. And then as we answer it, we may find that we want to offer up our parts of our question, right? That might be similar or worded slightly differently, and navigate that together. So I think this is a good question to start us off. And this is, how can individuals navigate the intersection of spiritual leadership and social activism, support their communities while remaining vigilant in the face of oppression and opposing radical views? I'm going to read that again. How can individuals navigating the intersection of spiritual leadership and social activism support their communities while remaining vigilant in the face of oppression and opposing radical views? And the meat of this question is sort of, right, how do we stay in leadership and how do we stay in activism while also being there for our communities, right? In the intersection of that and the implications of those three things intersecting. And I'm going to go ahead and put this in the chat for those of you on the live stream, on those of you at the panel.
To me, the first thing that comes to mind is, and I think this is an answer to a lot of the questions we'll be sharing today, is listening. Listening with an open heart, an open mind, and compassion. So whatever type of leadership role you're in, educator role, community role, whether you're a parent, a teacher, right, an artist, a student, how can you listen and learn from the people with lived experience on what you are being an activist for, what you are being a leader for? So whether that is, a spiritual community such as yoga, right? That's a huge one. How can you listen to the people of the origins of yoga, right? To where it came from? How can you learn directly from different sources other than just the mainstream media? Because as leaders in any setting, we have to provide people with information. And as we've noticed, a lot of information isn't shared in mainstream media or in mainstream historical documents and books. So how can we create that space to learn from and listen to people within the communities that are experiencing the different types of systemic oppression, which obviously has many intersections, but that's the first thing that comes to mind for me.
Thank you, Mackie. I would like to quickly respond to that. And I think that listening is so important. And what came to mind for me was the ability to listen with eyes unclouded by hate, right? And with a heart that is open. And the only way to do that is to walk this fine balance, right, of restorative practice and grounding, while also balancing that with being informed and educated, right? And I think that's one of the intersections that we're talking about. But in my experience, this practice of listening, while it is so important, it can so easily become clouded and distorted by our lenses if we are in anger and in pain and in despair ourselves.
I appreciate that, Dante. I just wanted to follow up and first thank Mackie for that response. I think another word that comes to mind is embodiment. In terms of navigating an intersection of spiritual leadership and activism, we cannot be susceptible or uncurious regarding the perspectives of others, especially, as Mackie said, who it is we're trying to advocate for or be active for. And embodiment, in my opinion, means living the values of that curiosity, of that truth, of that spiritual practice that guides with the absence of hate, as you said, Dante. But it's something that, if only embodied, can we truly move forward on that path. If it's something that we're aspiring toward, it's still subjective and susceptible to influences that are not productive. And so that's why the word embodiment came to my mind, because, yeah, as I said, if we are not embodying it, we are susceptible to being influenced by things that are not a part of our spiritual journey for activism.
Absolutely, Logan. I appreciate you sharing that. And to kind of pick up where you left off with embodiment, when it comes to a practical application of embodiment practices, one thing that I've learned is to look at the pain, is to look at the source of where you're experiencing these imbalances, where you're feeling these disruptions. And in order for you to feel these things, we must look at them. We must feel them. We must see them. We must, like Mackie said, listen. And only true healing and true embodiment comes with that acknowledgement. This goes from our personal everyday practice into global awareness and cultivation of healing as well. Another thing that Mackie you brought up was the concept of source, and going and listening and being vigilant with the people to listen to the people who are directly experiencing what's happening, to listen to the people who are the originators of spiritual practices. And in order for us to do that, we need to be vigilant and also open our hearts and open our minds to what the source is saying. And I feel that in spiritual communities, there is a really high priority placed on this concept of source, tapping into source, connecting with source. And I think that we can ground that concept by becoming more conscious of the tangible sources around us in this physical world as well.
So beautifully said. Thank you, all of you. What really stood out to, one thing that stood out to me that Nero said was something that you said along the lines, right, of listening. And you know, I can't help but it comes up in me how, right, as we are trying to connect with source, we're often looking towards, and I feel like the answer here of what is spiritual activism is sort of, we're teasing it out and we're coming to the definition of it, right? But we're actively wanting to be connected to source, and so many of the ways that we have learned to do that have been from indigenous, marginalized people, right? So much of the wisdom, so much of the knowledge, so much of the teachings and the books and the practices and the tools have been coming from and are held by indigenous, BIPOC, marginalized groups. So for me, spiritual activism is also recognizing the sacredness of these bodies of people and the wisdom that they hold, and fighting for their preservation and fighting for them to have a voice and to have a platform and to have land and to have freedoms, because they are human and because they deserve it, absolutely, but also because of the sacredness of the information and the wisdom that they hold and have held for so long. And there are so many keys buried in that wisdom, or not buried in that wisdom, right? That we can use collectively, right? We can pull from this source, we can pull from that, from this text, from this literature, from this wisdom, from this tribe, and we can weave this tapestry of meaning to bring in a new vision, right? But we're not going to be able to do it as one individualistic person or community in a linear way of thinking and working and navigating through the world without actively practicing inclusivity and lifting up and protecting those who hold so much spiritual wisdom, right? And we think of something as simple as tarot and all of the ties that something like tarot has to the parts of the world right now that are going through this genocide. And I think that right there is a fantastic demonstration and representation of spiritual wisdom and the intersection of spiritual activism and politics, and the importance of preserving this information and this wisdom, because we owe it to ourselves and we owe it to each other to do so.
So much love for that response, Dante. Thank you. I really just wanted to add on to your definition of spiritual activism. In addition to everything you said, I feel like, and this comes back to, what I was saying earlier about embodiment and what Nero said about embodiment. I think that spiritual activism is activism with an emphasis, if not a commitment to embodiment. And what that means in terms of this definition for me is acknowledging and rejecting systems of oppression that interlock to profit off of, if not perpetuate, desensitization, demoralization, disembodiment, because there's so much to be gained from our numbness, from our disconnection from one another, our ambivalence, as we spoke to earlier. It's all profitable under our, white cis hetero capitalist patriarchy. I think that is why embodiment is so such a profound word to me, is because it rejects all of those in its nature.
When you said acknowledgement, Logan, it just made me think how it just feels difficult at moments when we can't even get to that first step. There's still so many people, including in the spiritual community or the education community, the activist community, who just won't even acknowledge the systems of oppression. So for me, I feel that spiritual activism, spirituality in general, it really goes hand in hand with decolonization. And decolonization has to begin with the self. And it's for everyone. It's for white people and indigenous people, BIPOC people, because all of us have been colonized. Some of us have ancestors who were colonizers. Some of us have ancestors who were colonized, but we're all currently continuing to be colonized this very moment. And I think something, I guess a question I have is like, how can we continue to decolonize ourselves, and work on dismantling these systems of oppression, but also using our privilege and using our voice to continue to work within these systems. And that's what I see a lot in the spiritual community, is once you have felt that you have evolved as an individual, you're kind of just separate from that. That's what I see a lot. You're above that. It's about my vibrations, and different terms are used for spiritual bypassing. And I personally believe that a lot of that comes from the white community, not taking the time to understand our own identities, our own histories, our own ancestors, our own role in colonization, past and present, and our own role in our own duty to decolonization. So I see a lot of people in these communities. And of course, it's people from all sorts of backgrounds, but speaking as a white person and noticing that the majority do seem to be other people of European descent who kind of don't ever go deeper into their own culture, their own identity, their own history, and just kind of latch on to a certain maybe activist cause or helping a certain group of people, or taking the spirituality from a certain indigenous group or practice from a different culture. And if we aren't willing to do that individual work of decolonizing ourselves, then that is going to spread into our spiritual practices and our spiritual activism and any type of work that we do as leaders. So I guess I'm just curious what everyone thinks about that, because that's a question I've had for over a decade, is how can someone be this well-meaning, spiritual, loving, caring about the world, it seems, right? But still perpetuate and uphold systems of oppression, in even through things like microaggressions, right? Even through things like cultural appropriation, small actions, right, that add to these bigger problems. There's a lot of like color blindness within that community, this community. So I think we're seeing that right now. We see so many people wanting to pray for Ukraine or Paris, or so interested in this submarine that fell with 5 people, I think, in the ocean. And we can't ignore that there's more of an outcry and more attention put on these atrocities that are happening when they are people that look European, that look white versus not. And you see it within the spiritual community as well. And I guess I want to know so I'll just turn that into one question. How can we work to decolonize ourselves and dismantle these systems of oppression, but also use our privilege to work within the system? And part of that might mean helping to educate our peers or open their eyes to this harm that's being caused by the silence, the spiritual bypassing, the color blindness. I said a lot, little bit all over the place, sorry.
Thank you, Mackie. I would like to respond while I have some thoughts in my mind. I love this question, and the fact that you've had this question for 10 years and you feel like it hasn't been answered, I think speaks volumes. I thought when you talked about this, a person came to my mind, and I want to trigger warning this before I share this story, trigger warning for suicide. But I had a very dear friend of mine who actually was the person who opened my eyes in my early 20s to racial oppression and genocide and politics. And really, it was like the person who helped open my eyes to all of this and sort of birth that part of Dante into the world, right? She was kind of the midwife for that aspect of myself to wake up, right? And she was of European descent. And one day we were sitting in the apartment on a very dark day, and she was in a very bad place, a very dark place. And there's something that she said that has haunted me for years. And that was, one day she said, Dante, I wake up every day and I can't get the thought out of my mind that you and so many other BIPOC people would be better off if we just offed ourselves as white European people of descent. It would be one less colonizer in your space, breathing your air, eating the food in your fridge, polluting the air. And I remember when she said that, I immediately thought, I know that shame. I know that shame because as a BIPOC person, I've had to navigate so much shame for my race, for my color, for my ancestry, for my spirituality. And I know what that suffocating shame feels like. Now, the reason that I share this story, and she's doing great now. The reason I share this story is because there's something here that both sides need from each other. And what that is love and support. But if our hearts are full of anger and hate and despair, unfortunately, there are some of us who may hear these things, right? And it's easier when we have, you know, depersonalized or distance ourselves from the humanity of European people or the colonizing people, right? To just say, yes, the planet would be better off without you. But this is exactly where the cycle, the intergenerational cycle, starts all over again, right? Of that anger and that hatred and that rage just repackaging itself and bubbling up as something else, which is anger that wants to be healed and transmuted into love. So to answer your question, Mackie, my part of my answer here is, how do we show up and be in love? And it requires a very acute understanding of these cycles of trauma, of ancestral trauma, of intergenerational trauma, and how they recycle in these situations, and how we may show up in righteous pain and in righteous anger and in righteous despair with a desire to cut off people, push them away, dehumanize them further because we are in pain. And another quote I just want to wrap up with that comes to mind is, hurt people hurt other people, right? We lash out and hurt other people because we are in pain, but causing more pain and separation is not going to bring us together. And unfortunately, for a lot of us in the spiritual community, we have so much work to do around educating ourselves so that we can show up in love and break these cycles, these intergenerational cycles. And there's a huge intergenerational cycle of oppression happening right now in real time as the clock is ticking, and we are seeing it on both sides, the Palestinian and the Israeli side, living and attempting to heal and connect and come together, while also just moving through this space that is so thick with intergenerational trauma, right? But it incites something within all of us that we can connect with, and that's oppression from whatever side. Our voice is being silenced, right? But instead of reacting with reactivity and more anger and more separation, the turning point happens when we learn how to show up with love and connection. And that requires us to be in love and have a spiritual practice every day that we can come back to keep us grounded in how to be in love and how to be in connection with ourselves without losing our own humanity. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dante. I 100% agree that in order for us to break these intergenerational cycles, in order for us to break cycles that are happening right now in real time, we have to create a model for ourselves, a practice for ourselves of what union and healing and restoration and liberation looks like. So we see this struggle for healing happening not only on a global scale, but speaking personally, this is happening on a personal level as well, finding ways to even visualizing and creating what does embodiment, love, unionization, harmony look like inside of my life before I can even start expressing that or imposing that or delivering that out into the community as well. How can we internalize that loving, healing cycle within ourselves? And I think that there's answers for that, and that answer is going to be different for the individual. And what I think is where we find overlaps in that love practice as individuals, those focal points and those intersections could possibly translate into community and intergenerational healing as well. Another thing that I wanted to speak on was something that Mackie was sharing, which was raising your consciousness in a sense. And I feel that one thing that we can do as spiritual teachers and leaders is discuss things like the chakras, discuss things like energy, discuss things like consciousness and source from a more grounded and aware and informed perspective. Because at the end of the day, one person might have been taught that opening their third eye means that they can see other realms and other dimensions, and on certain levels that's true. We must also acknowledge with this opening of our third eye, our ability to visualize and see the world as it currently is. And to see the world as it is with our third eyes open is to see the imbalances and the injustices as they are as well. And from this space, I feel that with this open sense of consciousness, it's hard to deny the fact that remaining neutral means that you're moving in the direction that only perpetuates more division, more genocide, more ethnic cleansing, and more pain, which then continues to perpetuate this intergenerational pain.
Thank you, Nero. I wanted to pull from a little bit of what each of you have said as I sort of synthesize what I wanted to contribute, because I think starting with Mackie, we're talking about how do we embody decolonization. And the first thing that came to my mind as that was said was decolonization as a daily practice, but also subsequently compensating or following that up with indigenizing. You know, we're not just talking about, yes, we need to pull apart the colonial frameworks that have permeated the way that we think and the way that we see the world and the way that we treat one another. But the solution to building a foundation, once we do start to accomplish that, is to indigenize, to look to indigenous thought leaders and practitioners, and to reclaim a relationship, an indigenous relationship to the land, each other. And I think that there are so many indigenous thought leaders that are talking about that practice as indigenizing as something that needs to follow up decolonization. Otherwise, we are just taking apart our thoughts, and we're just taking apart the way that we move and we breathe and the way that we look at people, and not, as Dante has brought up, bringing back into it this radical, and this is newer language than indigenizing, but this radical self-love. I think, Mackie, that you mentioned that, this radical self-love. And I think about decolonizing and indigenizing specifically from the positionality of people of European descent like myself. And I think about those microaggressions, that leaking out of colonial ideologies that Mackie was saying. How do we, how can such good-natured, good-intentioned people still be revealing these biases? How are they still taking place? How have they not, pulled them apart? How have we not pulled them apart? And I think for me, and this is very much coming from my spiritual practice, I think the way that that manifests itself is the difference between, structural or like social deconstruction of our ideologies versus spiritual and intrinsic and introspective deconstruction. So for me, an example to kind of contrast the two, I see, stepping forward in social activism and saying that you are about decolonization. I think it was maybe 3 years ago, there was a big movement of decolonizing our bookshelves, our libraries, only pulling from sources and materials and thought provokers that were indigenous or just not people who were perpetuating harm. And yet that, I think, cultural phenomenon, if you will, took place 3 years ago. And it's like nothing actually happened when you look at a lot of people that are speaking about Palestine and right in this moment. So things like that taking place in the social sphere, but not the flip side, which I would call shadow work, and decolonization shadow work that needs to take place. And for me, that synthesizes in my mind what the three of you were speaking to. And for me, following that up with that shadow work that turns into the language that we use For me, I think language is the deepest reflection of what we hold in our hearts and our spirits, the deepest reflection of what it is that we think about the world. And from my perspective as somebody who identifies as trans non-binary, I know that language has the effect of molding safety or not. And of course, that's the same with other marginalized and minoritized communities. Language is the manifestation. And that's why when we talk about love and we talk about harmony and compassion, like Nero, what you said, how are we modeling that? How are we speaking about ourselves and about other people? Because that manifestation of language, the way that comes from us and into the world, is the true reflection of how we are embodying that. Also said a lot there, but really appreciate all three of you. I wanted to, if we're ready, ask the question, what advice do you have regarding restorative practices to combat social activism fatigue? And I just wanted to start that with mindfulness practices. Something that has been monumentally sustaining these last couple of weeks has been somatic breaks, a somatic first aid kit. Meditation, yes, most definitely, but taking the time when the emotions are just insurmountable and grounding physically to the ground, feet to the soil if I can, breath work, identifying what's in my environment, finding comfort in other people, and if I need to, bracketing or pausing the thoughts that need to be deconstructed from that overwhelm, from that pain for a later date. So I'll put the question in the chat that I have if we're ready to answer that, but that was what came up in my mind. My question to you all is, what advice do you have regarding restorative practices to combat social activism fatigue? How do we sustain ourselves, you know? And earlier I was speaking to the fact that mindfulness and somatic breaks is, and I've told Dante this in our own conversations, has been a survival tactic for the last couple of weeks in particular.
I think the answer to that question for me really connects to a lot of things that we've already brought up, such as decolonization. And I feel that almost everything comes back to that to an extent. And I think it really comes down to building a daily habit, ritual, practice of radical self-love, because it starts within ourselves, right? Dante mentioned earlier, you know, something about the shame, right? And the guilt. And if we are continuing to deal with shame and guilt in our personal lives on a daily basis, it can be really, really hard to take care of ourselves, especially in times where you are trying to be vocal and speak up about injustice of other people who are different than you. So just building that into a daily practice, and then when times are really difficult, when you're really fatigued, when you're energetically drained, just continuing to tap into what you've already built as much as you can, just doing your best. And I always come back to the 4 agreements. Do your best. Do your best. That's the one that I'm coming back to right now, because it can feel really hard in a situation where you are fatigued, where you feel helpless almost, where you feel that no one's listening. You feel so angry, sad, whatever emotions you're feeling. Instead of pushing those away, ignoring them, or building them up to just completely take over you, do your best. And if your best that day doesn't look like doing all of your normal spiritual practices or your normal self-care routines, that's fine. But also don't punish yourself for having the privilege of living in a safe space, having shelter, having food, having clothes, having water. if we start to punish ourselves as individuals and not allow time to even, like you mentioned, I think in your introduction, Logan, just taking care of yourself, right? Drinking enough water. We can almost subconsciously start to punish ourselves by getting out of these practices. So for me personally, I have not been doing as much these past few weeks, especially this past few days. And I just try to do my best, move my body, stretch my body a little bit, journal a little bit. And it's okay if it's for 5 minutes instead of 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mackie. I would like to follow up with something, a thought that came to my mind. And that was, I just want to share that a few days ago, I came to this point where I was at a certain vibrational frequency after consuming so much media and feeling so helpless and in despair, like you described, like nobody's listening, right? And feeling like I can see what's about to happen and like there's not enough work, that it's not being stopped. And I'm like seeing this unfold in real time. And I came to this place in my heart where I shared on social media on a story, and I use the word shame, and I'm gonna tie this into to what we were talking about, but I said something to the effect of, shame on you if you're on social media right now and you're just promoting your book at this time, promoting your masterclass, promoting your manifestation course, promoting your tarot readings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and paying no attention or, acknowledging the humanitarian crisis going on. And I said, those words escaped my mouth. I said, shame on you. And what I noticed about not even 2 hours later, I had run out of water in my apartment because we buy bottled water in Mexico. And I went to order groceries. And for a moment, I thought, I don't deserve to order water. Like, I don't deserve to fill up my glass with water, because there are people right now as I speak who are dying of thirst and dying of hunger. And I sat with that for like half an hour, that this feeling of shame that I don't deserve to drink the water. I don't deserve to order the groceries because other people are suffering. And I had to work so hard to bring myself out of that place, because we can't help each other from that place, right? We can't show up. We can't promote love and connectivity and continue with our humanity if we're in this place of shame. And so that is something that is so important to restorative practice, is recognizing when that shame starts to enter our vibrational frequency, our vibrational field, and we absorb so much shame and guilt that we may start projecting it not only on others, but also to ourselves, which is when you mentioned that, Mackie, about, about these things coming up in us, I think we said something like self-punishing may have been the word you used. I don't remember. Recognizing where that's coming from and how we can do the shadow work around that to heal that.
I just really quickly wanted to respond to the guilt for our needs being met and being in a different part of the world where there is enough distance that, we're not on the Egyptian border where they're talking about hearing bombings. We're not in a space, or a lot of us maybe are not in a space where the tangible manifestations are permeating into our reality. And I think that guilt is something one of my professors said to me, and I just wanted to share this sentence, was that guilt comes from the place of desire for everybody to have the same as we're experiencing. That was something that shouldn't be a privilege, is having our basic needs and safety met, but it's something that we want for everyone. And so the fact that we have it doesn't mean that, it shouldn't be a finite source. Basically, it should not be a finite source to be safe and to know that you will make it through the night and you won't be in fear for your life when you wake up, and that you have water that you can order and food that you can consume and loved ones that you know where they are. And it's because we want that for everyone that includes ourselves. And I think that that spoke to me so deeply for the same reason that you mentioned, Dante, where, the idea of going to the grocery store and filling my fridge with options has felt debilitating because it makes me sick. It makes me so sick to think that I have abundance and there are people that yeah. I just wanted to share that because it spoke so deeply to me.
Thank you, Logan. That spoke really deeply to me as well. And a word that I noticed in the way that you framed your question is the word combat, to combat social activism fatigue. And I think that that's a very suitable word because it's an action word. It's a word that acknowledges that we're in the middle of a war. We're in the middle of a fight right now, not only externally, but also internally. So I think that part of this war is absolutely a physical war, and it's not even a war in this case. It's a whole genocide. But this war is not only a war of the physical, but it's also a war of the mind. And what we're seeing a lot of is either pushing for neutrality, especially in spiritual spaces, or pushing for fear and to recoil and to throw your hands up to think that what you have to share or the support that you can show doesn't matter. So if you're able to convince a group of people that there's nothing they can do to help, then you're winning that psychological war straight out of the gate. If you're flooding people with thoughts of shame, thoughts of doubt, thoughts of guilt, those people aren't operating at their best to help, to stand up for basic human rights, and you're winning that psychological war. So we can combat this fatigue that we're feeling by going more internally so that we can continue to give externally, to acknowledge the abundance that's around us for those who have access to that abundance, to acknowledge it as something that is, like you said, Logan, fundamental human rights, to acknowledge with that open and broadened consciousness that this should be extended to everyone, and to allow our cups to fill, and with whatever restorative practices that we have. For me, it's monitoring my breath and allowing myself to feel breath even when it's uncomfortable, to allow myself to surrender to breath, understanding that it's abundance and not something that I need to limit with shallow breathing or non-breathing at all. To be an expression of abundance through my circulatory system, through my lungs, through my bringing in and transformation of prana throughout my body. This is how we restore ourselves so that we can also help to restore others. And one other thing that came to mind is taking things back to honoring indigenous practices is also acknowledging the indigenous concept of the cyclical nature of things. We can't fix ourselves. We can't find healing in the snap of a finger. We can't heal the world at a snap of a finger. And part of that psychological warfare is to push this concept of instant gratification. And if you can't instantly gratify yourself or the world, then you're better off not doing it. But I think when we return to the understanding of the cyclical nature of things, the cyclical process of healing, we can then better put ourselves in a position to acknowledge when it's the part of the cycle that we need to rest, restore, and then move back into that activism.
Oh, go ahead.
Thank you, Nero. I heard you offering up some advice around, right, movement and breath work. And we've talked about somatic practices. Logan, I think you touched on that. And something I want to offer up from myself and from my ancestors is plant medicine. And I think that this can be oftentimes when someone says plant medicine or ancestral medicine, it can conjure up images of, really intense ceremony or, these extreme, psychedelic experiences. And I want to ground this in a different definition for us and for those who may be listening. Plant medicine also means things like exploring and learning about accessible, non-psychedelic plants too, right? As medicine to support our central nervous systems, to support our bodies, to support our fatigue, to support our minds, to support our spirit. And there's an abundance of plant medicine that can work in tangent with so many of these practices to support those things. And cacao is accessible to just about anyone if you're able to purchase it. It's a heart opening medicine. Roses are amazing as well for keeping the heart open, for keeping the spirits lifted. There are plant medicines for grief and loss to help us move through and transmute those emotions. There are vitamins as well, and vitamins that can be found in certain plants. B12s are absolutely imperative when we're in stress, when our central nervous systems are feeling shorted out. And I'm not a nutritionist, but in my work with plants and with plant medicine and with food and nutritional medicine, I have found so much support through those pathways and through things like maca and matcha, right? For energy, for balance, for restorating my body. Shilajit, if I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, is an incredible supplement that is available to us, and I encourage people to look that up as well. And there's just so many more, and so just wanting to offer up plant medicine as well here as a restorative practice to combat social activism fatigue. And of course, while there are the other psychedelic, right, plant medicines, and those have their place and their time, that plant medicine is not limited to just those types of medicine or even to just those types of medicine and ceremony. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that, Dante, and just for clarifying for those listening, what that actually means, because there are a lot of misconceptions, and, we can cloud ourselves a lot with non-plant medicine. So that's all I'll say about that. But I also wanted to share that I think another way to combat that is to continue with our purpose. I think, for me, my purpose, my passion is working with youth through healing, but also education. And that can be like academic education and other types of education. And it can be easy to feel like I have to stop everything and just focus on what's happening right now, which I've actually been doing that to an extent, but also creating time, even if it's less time than I would like or than I normally do, to continue to pour into that work of, in my case, trying to design workshops, courses, curriculum to help with education and healing for all different age groups, early childhood to adult. And, recognizing that this is never going to end, unfortunately. This work will never end in our lifetime. And so how can we build what is going on into what we are currently working on or what we are currently doing or the way that we're speaking to others? And I think that a big part of that is just that consistent, decolonizing practice by doing even just the small things such as stating what native unceded land that we are on. That's one small step that we can take to acknowledge. Does it actually give people their land back? Does it actually get rid of these oppressive systems? No, but like we mentioned way earlier, I think Logan mentioned acknowledging, right? That's kind of the first step. So it kind of brings me to another question, but I don't know, I don't want to stop the or end the other question, but it's kind of related maybe. Is that cool for me to offer a new question, or did anyone want to say anything else about the fatigue?
Logan, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say that, Mackie, your inclusion of your purpose mentioning children just brought to me the vision of teaching a very young human how to walk and the pacing with which that learning curve takes place in. And I think pacing is a word that came to mind, especially with social activism fatigue. And it's so and you so beautifully brought up purpose, and I think that it coincides with that. And the reason that this metaphor of like teaching a young human how to walk is that you can't rush the process of learning certain things. You can't rush the pacing with which we come to coexist with things that we will carry with us for the rest of our lives. And as you said, this is something that we will have to carry for the rest of our lives, and that we should choose to carry for the rest of our lives. And I think that pacing, and the book Rest is Resistance by Tricia Hersey comes to mind. So brilliant, highly, highly recommend. Very accessible language on this subject, but that pacing yourself for the long game, for the longevity of what it is you have to contribute so that you don't burn out, because activism burnout is so common and such a common experience. That is a radical self-love act, is to pace yourself. And so that's why when you brought up educating youth, I just had to share that. So I appreciate you holding that space, Maki, to bring that in before you move on. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely, Logan. Pacing ourselves and acknowledging that this is a marathon, an multi-generational, multi-dimensional marathon. And in order for us to show up as the activists that we want to show up as, it's going to be important for us to acknowledge the fact that this is a long game, and also, like I mentioned earlier, a cyclical process. So with that being said, another way that I could see it being beneficial to combat activism fatigue is to, yes, come into ourselves and work on ourselves as individuals, but also being intentional to co-regulate with those who we feel safe around by holding each other, like physically, so that we can feel that connection not only within ourselves but with each other as well. And I think that's all I wanted to share about that. Thank you, Mackie, for opening that up.
I guess the question that came to mind is, how can we be more conscious and intentional with the words and language that we use? And I think that is something that we really need to think about moving forward with this work, is how can we do that every single day? Be conscious, be intentional, and be compassionate with the language and the words we use. How do you find that balance when there are people defending a genocide? Because this is like a real question, because I don't know. It's really, really hard for me. That's something I've struggled with. And I have worked on the anger, because I have realized me going and speaking to someone who has a different perspective than me out of anger is not going to solve anything. So how can we do that? And I think I keep bringing it back to decolonization, but really it comes down to in every single thing we do, whether it's us just in a classroom speaking in front of the class, whether it's us leading a class as a teacher, as an educator, as a healer, as whatever your role is, leading a conversation with your friends or family, us, choosing to boldly, unapologetically, but compassionately kind of weave in those themes, right? I've seen, there's a sound healing musician teacher that I know named Marcus Fung, and he really is a great model at that because he, acknowledges ancestors and indigenous people in this way that just kind of brings it into the flow of his music, his sound healing sessions, and all these things. And I'm so inspired by him because it's so accessible, I feel, to people who maybe don't have that mindset, who don't have that understanding. So how can we kind of, without being neutral or without being, very vague, right? Because being vague and neutral about things like genocide, in my opinion, is not an option. So how can we do that every day, not just when there's a big worldwide issue or a big thing happens? How can we continue that every single day?
Thank you, Mackie. I want to offer up some of my thoughts on that. And I think when we enter into these conversations where the other person in the conversation may be coming from a place of fear, right, or misinformation or miseducation, I think primarily it's really important to recognize that the humanity that we both have in this situation and what we do share in common is that we are probably both coming from a place of fear in these tense conversations that we may be having, right? I'm scared that you're not going to understand my point of view, and then this trauma and oppression is going to perpetuate. They're afraid that they may feel threatened or unsafe, or that their ego may be challenged, right? And that their central nervous system may be disrupted, so they stand their ground. But we are both coming from a place of fear, and to recognize that so that we can explore ways to move out of that and respond differently. And then the second thing I want to say is the power of silence. The power of silence and taking your energy and your attention and your focus away from situations, people, and relationships that are not nourishing or supportive to you, right? So there's two ways of engaging, and silence is a way to engage. And this came up for me just so front and center yesterday. I went for a walk. There was a particular conversation I had with somebody in the community online, and through WhatsApp, where they direct messaged me, and it was very triggering. I know it was very triggering for both of us. And I had a lot of compassion for this person, but essentially I was asked to volunteer my time and my services at a pro-Israeli event. But I was asked to do this without this person disclosing to me that it was a pro-Israeli event, while they tried to get me to confirm my attendance before they really gave me the details, and then tried to tell me that they were not going to pay me, and that it was going to be me who was going to volunteer my time and services to do ceremony for their event. So anyways, I was very triggered on this phone conversation with this person, but I held so much compassion and just said, I understand you're trying to do something in the community to change the narrative and to bring people together, but this is not my space. This is not a place I'm going to show up. This is not somewhere I'm going to volunteer my time and services. But thank you for thinking of me. And they reacted not in a very high vibrational way, and I put that message on mute, and I put it in my little archive section of WhatsApp, which is there is a growing list of people in my archive section of WhatsApp that I just cannot engage with right now. And so the power of silence, I went on a walk yesterday, and just this whole, like, I didn't want to leave the house. I was self-isolating, and I recognized it, and I was like, I need to go for a walk. But then thinking, I don't want to go outside because what if I run into one of these people, or I have to engage in a conversation that feels unsafe, and I just don't know if I can do it. And my guides were encouraging me, it's okay, just, go for a walk. And I mean, I just get 5 minutes out the door, and I turn this corner, and here is this person right in my face. And she's holding her poodle, her toy poodle, and the poodle is just shaking. You can tell the poodle is absorbing all of this person's anxious energy. And she looks at me, and I remember I immediately felt this, like, desire to kind of ease the tension of the meeting and say something, to smile, hi, something. And my ancestors just clearly, like, that was a learning moment. They said, you don't have to open your mouth. You do not have to respond. And by you being silent, you're saying so much. And I didn't open my mouth, and I didn't say anything. And there was a very awkward, like, 1 minute where she just kind of had her mouth hanging open. And she gasped and said, I just can't with you, Dante. I just can't with you. I don't understand you. And she, like, kind of screamed at me and walked off. And I just felt so empowered and so grateful to my ancestors for just being like, shh, don't say a word. Don't say a word. Don't give your power away to her like that. Do not engage. You do not have to engage. So that story is to put words around the power of silence, and to give permission that you do not have to engage, right? So thank you.
I just wanted to first, Dante, thank you for sharing that with us so vulnerably. It reminds me of something that Mackie said earlier about balance. And I think in terms of language, there needs to be a reciprocity of understanding the foundation of that which you are speaking of. And I think that that can only be done by clarifying it, to kind of reference the story you just shared, in conversation regarding what it is to commit your time to something. There was a fundamental disconnection of what that means. What is something that is being asked of you? What is an offer versus what is something that is being imposed upon you? These fundamental disconnections that, I think, going back to Mackie's question about language, I personally hold within my heart that based on how different our wants and our desires and our socialization and our experiences have made us as individuals, it's such a miracle when we can understand one another. And it is such a profound moment when we know it and we feel it when we are understood. And we know that we cannot assume anything when we want to be understood. And so when that comes down to language, for me, that is quite transparently communicating, what do you mean by that? Or silence and allowing somebody to reveal to you what they mean, because they usually will. But my partner and I talk about this ad nauseum when it comes to what does that word mean to you. And that's why I'm so glad we started with defining spiritual activism, because all of us had a different perspective of what that significance was to us. And I think that speaks volumes to all language. All language has this different resonance, this different perspective, this different connection to every word that we speak. And I believe that the way that we self-talk, the way that we talk about ourselves, is the beginning of how our language needs to evolve and be modeled in our lives. And in conversation with another person, the general conversation that Dante spoke of, somebody saying, coming from fear of not being understood, and another person being fearful of hurting that other person. If we're coming from such different capacities, one from this shame of am afraid of being misunderstood because I don't really know what it is that I stand for, versus a fear that's coming from, I don't want to hurt somebody else because they don't understand or are not aware or are not informed about the subject we're speaking on and are coming from that fear. The fears are all disconnected, the motivations are all disconnected, and we cannot be speaking the same language until we come from the same foundation. So I think language and clarifying what it is, what we mean by genocide, what we mean by that, it seems so simple. It seems so simple to say that is not a debatable subject to me. That language right there, I'm saying that word because that is what I'm seeing in the world. But to say and to take the emphasis and to redirect it toward the language rather than the subject, to me has been absolutely like sustaining for those conversations, because Mackie, similar to you, I cannot fathom thinking that genocide is a debatable subject. So focusing on the language rather than the perspective has definitely carried me through some conversations.
Yes, Logan, there's power in finding commonality when it comes to our definitions of language, because how I've learned about language and how I perceive language is that there are placeholders or that there are symbols pointing at a deeper reality. And I think that when we use language to unite our realities so that we can see from a more foundational perspective is where we can start to build from. And I think the one thing that I can add to the power of language and the power of silence is also the power of listening. Like Mackie said towards the beginning of our conversation, being open to being corrected, especially by Indigenous leaders, or especially by someone who knows more than you, so that as we continue to listen and as we continue to open ourselves to correction, we can continue to refine that common language that unites all of us. And speaking of language, one question that I have is, what action steps would you suggest to somebody whose mind has been shaped by mainstream propaganda, but whose heart seeks to advocate for basic human rights?
I think that it's key that you said their heart seeks to advocate. And I think that ties back to what Dante mentioned is, unfortunately, in my personal life and all throughout social media and the media, you see a lot of people who don't seem to have that heart. And I think that kind of comes back to what Dante said, is it's okay to choose silence and in some cases step away from certain people, because that will just turn into this fight that isn't helping anyone, and it's just draining and draining us. And I think the first action step is just listening once again, teaching those people or suggesting to those people to listen, specifically listen to Black women, Black trans women, Indigenous women and people. Listening to the people who have unfortunately suffered the most from systemic oppression, right? And that's why a lot of people say Black Lives Matter, because if we can say that, that encompasses so much else, right? Trans Lives Matter. If we can say that, that encompasses the queer community as a whole. So I think directing those people to just, we can give them some resources. Here are some people that I've learned from. Here are some books. Here are some Instagram accounts to follow. Here are some movies to watch. Even just taking in art and literature, right, by Black and Indigenous people, I think is what we could tell someone who they have been shaped by that mainstream propaganda, just pointing out to them, most of what you've learned comes from a European colonizer framework. even a lot of spirituality and self-help books, it's so hard when you look up the authors. A lot of them are white men and women and straight people, right? So just pointing that out to them, because a lot of people aren't aware of that, and then giving them some resources to start learning from different types of people. That would be my answer to that question.
Thank you, Mackie. And as we begin to wrap up and make our way towards the ending of this conversation, I'd like to touch on a couple of things here. Yes, listening, absolutely. Resources, absolutely. Education, absolutely. Being able to identify when people are coming from this, right, this heart-centered place of wanting to advocate for basic human rights, but they may be misinformed or miseducated. And I saw so much of that with the example I gave you earlier of this person wanting to bring their community together, wanting to have a vigil, but being so deeply misinformed, right? And being able to recognize that requires a lot of our own inner work and our own mental decolonization and our own heart-centered practices to be able to see that through all of the other things happening. I would like to just quickly touch on some things that I just wanted to bring to the conversation. And one of my questions, I'm going to answer it in, as well as I ask it, but what is some advice that we can perhaps give to those of us on social media platforms who are afraid or are worried about speaking out because of shadow banning and losing their accounts? Because I think this is really important because of the people listening to this conversation, the people in community with us, ourselves, many of us here having platforms that are based in that's such a big part of our business, right? So speaking out can literally mean us losing our income. It can mean us losing our financial freedoms. And so for so many people who are not speaking out, choosing not to speak out so that they don't lose their platforms, I think that it's important that we see the humanity in that, right? And the fear that comes along with not having financial security, not shaming them for that, but also reminding us that this is why it comes back to community as well. Because if social media is your only community, that puts you at risk for so many things. Losing that account, like we've seen it happen, where these people just don't have a source of income anymore. They've lost it overnight because they've been, their account's been shut down. It is just a reminder to come back to your community. Those of you in your families, in your circles that will be there, who will support you, those who will recommend your services to friends, those who will, repost your content, those who will share your services by word of mouth. And I'm here to do that for, people in my circle, listeners, if this is something that you've personally experienced, right? To reach out so that we can help lift each other's voices up if you have been a victim of shadow banning or account deletion or those sorts of things, so that you don't have to be alone in that. But also being reminded that it is important to be in community with people around you that are not on social media. And so that's what I would like to say to that. And then the last question I just want to kind of ask as we wrap up, because I do think this is a great question to segue into as we're wrapping up, is asking each other, what kind of support, visibility, and acknowledgement do you currently need from your communities to feel supported, seen, and heard? So say that again, what kind of support, visibility, and acknowledgement? So what do you need right now? Because I know that this question will probably resonate. The answers we come up with will probably resonate with a lot of people, right? Maybe remind us of things that we didn't know that we needed. So what do we need right now to feel connected, to feel seen, to feel heard, supported, whether it's our online communities or offline communities? What can we do for each other and for ourselves? Thank you.
I wanted to respond to this because I think that it coincides with Nero's earlier question about action steps. Personally, when I think about if there's a internal confliction or contradiction of, like what you were bringing up, Dante, about shadow banning, if there's something that you're feeling called to share or to advocate for, and you know that there are tangible repercussions that would affect your livelihood, where do you reconcile the two taking place? And something like an example of that that's taking place for me today and answers your question is, today there's a protest in Los Angeles where I am. And part of the fear surrounding physically being a part of this protest is the people that I surround myself with who are visibly queer, identify as visibly trans as well. And there's a safety component of, who it is that where their safety lies in terms of being in physical spaces with that many groups of people. And I think that when I am contradicted or conflicted in my heart space about whether or not to take action, removing myself from the exposure to social media as I feel is necessary for my pacing and my sustainability of my activism. So today I took a long, long time away after spending way too long trying to seek out more information about the last few hours in Gaza, and decided that I was going to seek out communities of queer folks that were collaborating on attending this protest in solidarity together and creating accountability and support systems for how are we going to make sure that we are safe in this space together, and found one. And it didn't take that much to find people that were also seeking that solidarity and that comfort and that safety. And what a privilege it is first to be in a space where I can seek that out and find it. But if it were in the space where that wasn't present, how can I create that space? Well, and that's a resonant statement for me. And based on what we've said for the past time, for the amount of time we've had together, is before I seek it out, how can I model it? And for me, that modeling was, how can I create safety for other people who are feeling that part of their identity is in contradiction with their heart's purpose at this moment for safety reasons. And so now there's a group of us that are doing printmaking and writing letters to representatives and then going to the protest together. And to me, that was just encapsulates an example of the kind of support, visibility, and acknowledgement that I needed. If it wasn't present and I didn't discover it, I was ready to create it. And once again, that came back to pacing, because I couldn't have been able to create it if I wasn't also taking care of myself. So that was what I wanted to share.
Thank you, Logan. Feeling safe and having community support is by yourself. Like, you don't have to isolate because the world is too much right now. And as a continuation of that, I think that what I acknowledge that I need is co-regulation, is to be held, to have a safe space to express my heart.
I think that I think that a lot of it comes back to duality. And so what I would like to see, or what I wouldn't necessarily say there's a specific thing that I need right now, but what I'd like to see is people acknowledging that duality, right? There's always going to be suffering and there's always going to be joy at the exact same time in the world. And I think it's really, really common for us, especially in this society, to just really try to detach from the suffering, really try to detach from the pain, try to detach from violence. And we can hold both. So in our spaces, whether that's your social media page for your business, personal page, your website, you can share both. And that might feel really, really hard, but both are currently existing. And I think where the pain comes for a lot of us is seeing that a lot of people are just trying to share the joy. They're ignoring the suffering. They're ignoring that and pushing it away and detaching from it, and just trying to share their content they're creating, or their normal life, right? And we can share both, and we can hold both truths at the same time, even though it's very difficult. Because if the people who are currently going through a genocide in Palestine can do that, which we see videos of children painting and laughing, and doctors and journalists singing, right? Singing. and laughing with kids, dressing up for the kids. If they can do that, then we can. We have to try. And I think also I think something that Logan, a lot of people who are visibly trans and queer, it's very unsafe. I saw that India Moore was arrested last night. A Black trans actress and activist, and thankfully she's been released, but my heart sunk. And it sunk not because I'm a fan of hers, but because she's a Black trans woman. My heart sunk when I saw she was arrested, because I didn't know what would happen to her in the jail, compared to if a straight passing white woman, was arrested. So we have to build that radical self-love within ourselves first, so that those of us with the most privilege can be out there putting our physical bodies out there. Because if we have the privilege of our skin color, of how our gender identity is perceived by others, whether we're queer, straight, trans, cis, right? If someone perceives us as a straight, cis, white person, we have that privilege to be out there physically. But if we cannot build that radical self-love within ourselves to love and accept ourselves, how are we going to go put ourselves out on the line for others? So I think it kind of comes back to, I would just like to see more people being conscious with their own healing, right? Because healing is a lot deeper than what we're seeing right now in a lot of social media and spiritual communities.
Yes, and I misread the question the first time and missed the online part. I think that one thing that could be very helpful, and also linking it back to the question about potentially being shadow banned and all of that, is to feel that we're, like you said, Dante, in the chat, being the change that we want to see in the world. And I think that everything that's culminated up to this point has been shaped by culture. Culture has allowed this genocide, this pain to happen, this colonization mindset to happen, this anti-Blackness and anti-transness to happen. And I think that moving forward, we have to start by being the change that we want to see. We have to redefine the culture that we want to be a part of within our own lives. And then also see if we can also access the support of our online communities to be part of that shift in culture. Because everything that we're doing right now is planting the seeds for that change that we see, that we will hopefully see cycles and cycles from now. So encouraging the sharing, encouraging the saving, encouraging the education, encouraging the exposure to people who are indigenous, people who have more knowledge, people who are sharing their joy and their pain, sharing that with our online community, and also asking our online community to share our joy and our pain and our perspectives as well, so that not only are we seen in the physical, but we're also seen in this virtual space that's been a product of culture as well.
Nero, thank you for saying that. I also missed the online community component, and I wanted to speak to that as well, because there was and I wish that I could identify the source of where this recommendation came from, but it was a call to prepare yourself for and have tools, as my dad would put it, have tools in your tool belt for encountering misinformation, for encountering hatred, like just blatant disregard for humanity, for having like copy and paste responses for when you encounter the inevitability that is propaganda or misinformation. And if you cannot share on your own platform for fear of your livelihood being compromised by that, which is such a real, tangible fear, and something that is so interesting to speak of, especially with like the polarity that is reality versus online community, and the distance that we may feel from the two at times like this, where it's like, how can something be taking place in the reality and there be silence in our online community? a point for another discussion. Those tools, especially in terms of how viscerally it can feel to be confronted with misinformation or with ideologies that so blatantly disregard humanity, having that preparation also provides you a moment of pause away from seeing it. So I think the balance of preparing yourself and having something outside of social media, like in your notes app on your phone or whatever it is, written in your journal to prepare yourself to respond, that can be a component of contradicting hate in your online community. And that's something that I need to see from more people commenting, saying, I'm not going to just see this perpetuated cycle of harm taking place in this comment section. I'm going to contribute to this because I'm not posting about it. So I'm going to make sure that I am contradicting it. You know, no hate to name drop this, but the people posting about Taylor Swift's album, darlings, I love that you're joyful about this joy and this woman reclaiming something that was stolen from her and her art and her content. I also need you to be balancing that. If you are present online, we're not going to be like similar to what Dante was speaking about earlier. We're not saying shame on you. We're saying what Mackie's saying, balance. It's polarity. It's encompassing all these different consciousnesses into one, and making sure that if you are going to be somebody who's present in your online community right now, that you are not just talking about one side. And I need to take that into my own heart space and to balance it with the joy of community conversations like this, because I have been just sharing one side of the pain and the hurt. And part of it has been self-punishment in terms of I can't do more. So I'm going to make sure that at least I am suffering in a minuscule comparison way to how people in Palestine are feeling right now. And I think that that's why I found such resonance in this question, is that balance is something that I know I need to model. So yeah, thank you for that question, Dante.
Thank you, Logan. Thank you, Nero. And thank you, Mackie. In respect of everyone's time, I'm going to go ahead and wrap us up. I'm receiving, well, what I'd like to say right now is what we're witnessing and what we're experiencing and what we're living through right now and today and this moment in history. It's not just decolonialization. It's not just healing. It's evolution. It's evolution of our humanity. It's evolution of our consciousness. And evolution looks messy. Evolution is not always linear. And so it's really important that we give ourselves grace, that we give ourselves patience, that we give ourselves love, and that we continue to stay plugged into community and continue to stay plugged into ourselves. So many important points were brought up today. And what is really coming through for me to share is that this is a marathon and not a sprint, right? These things have been happening for so many years and for so long. And while we're going to look at the news today and throughout this week and say we want it to stop now, the truth is it's not going to stop right now. So we don't have to put our central nervous systems in that space, in that dark space, and the other thing I want to say is to not succumb to the darkness so that we become the darkness, right? Not to be consumed by it, because the darkness can be magnetic, romantic, seductive, to where we just want to lean into the anger and the despair and the hatred because we feel identified, because we feel seen, because we feel heard. And that is dangerous. That is the cycle beginning to repeat itself again. So when you notice that in yourself and when you notice that in somebody else, that's when you can do something. That's when you can reach out. That's when you can say, hey, I notice you're not okay. Or, hey, can I cook you some dinner? Can I make you a cup of cacao? Can I sing you a song? Right? Because when we recognize these patterns starting to repeat, we have a responsibility to reach out, to do something and to say something. And this is going back to being the change that we want to see in the world. But don't succumb to that darkness. Don't fight so hard that you end up becoming the thing that you're trying to heal, right? So to be mindful of that, and to also give ourselves the grace to navigate this and the messiness that it is, and to keep coming back to ourselves and to our community. Thank you all so much for showing up to this meeting today on such a morning as today. Thank you all so much, and thank all of your ancestors and your spirit guides. Thank you so much. Thank you those whose lands that we occupy, for allowing us to exist here, for giving us ground beneath our feet. Thank you to the air for carrying our voice, for carrying our thoughts, for cleansing our spaces, for cleansing our hearts. Thank you to fire for helping us transmute this pain, transmute all of this suffering and emotion that we're witnessing and that we're in. And thank you for water, for allowing us to purify, for allowing us to flow, and for giving us the clarity and the connection to each other's and to ourselves. And thank you, Mother Earth. Thank you, Mother Earth. Thank you all for coming.